Everyone seems to think that by the age of 68, words can no longer hurt so much. That with age, the skin becomes thicker, not only in the literal sense, but also in a figurative sense. That's all nonsense. I, Marilyn Sloth, can say with certainty that words can destroy a person at any age. It has been exactly 1 year since the day my eldest son, Garrett, stood in the middle of my living room and uttered the words that still echo in my head at night. You were never a mother to me. Today, I'm sitting in that same living room, the same worn-out couch my husband Ralph bought when he was still alive, the same faded curtains I keep promising myself I'll replace, but never get around to. Next to me, on the coffee table, is a yellowed photo in a frame. It's me, Ralph, and our 3 children on the beach in Cape May. Peyton was 6, Garrett was 9, and little Ewan was only 3. It was the last summer we were a complete family. I slowly sip chamomile tea from a mug my neighbor Vinny gave me last Christmas. It's raining outside, typical fall weather for Cherry Hill, New Jersey. A few cars pass by, splashing through the puddles. It's Tuesday evening, and I have no plans. Nor do I have any plans for Wednesday or Thursday. I wonder if Garrett remembers that today marks exactly 1 year since we last saw each other. Probably not. He's never had a good memory for dates. He even forgot his wife's birthday once. I smile at my thoughts. Well, that's not my problem now. I close my eyes and mentally return to that day, my 67th birthday. I wasn't particularly enthusiastic about it. Age is just a number, and every year it brings less and less joy. But the children insisted on a family dinner. More precisely, Peyton insisted, she had always been in charge of organizing family events. Not out of a love for family values, but out of some strange sense of duty and perhaps a desire to control everyone and everything. "Mom, it's your birthday," she said in her commanding tone on the phone. "We're all coming over. I'll make a casserole. You don't have to do anything, just set the table." I didn't argue. To be honest, I had long since stopped arguing with my children. It was easier to agree than to explain that I would rather spend the day alone with a book or watching an old movie. That day, I got up early, as I had become accustomed to doing during my years working at the hospital. I had worked as a nurse in the anesthesiology department at Cooper Hospital in Camden for 36 years. It had defined the rhythm of my entire life. Early mornings, quick breakfasts, and constant rushing. Even after retiring 5 years ago, I couldn't change my routine. The body remembers. By 4 o'clock, I had set the table in the living room. My dining table was too small for the whole family. I laid out my best tablecloth and took out the special china, the one I only used on special occasions. Ralph and I bought these plates at a sale when we first got married. He died of a heart attack when Ewan was only 7. He died as suddenly as he had lived, quickly and brightly. Sometimes I think Ralph was too alive for this world, too loud, too passionate, too everything. After he died, I was left alone with 3 children and a mortgage. Ralph didn't leave any insurance. He always thought he'd take care of it later. That later never came. Peyton arrived first, punctual as always. She was followed by her husband Ricardo, a quiet Mexican who in 15 years of marriage had never learned to speak English without an accent. He was carrying a large casserole dish. Their 3 children, 12-year-old twins Diego and Miguel and 9-year-old Consuelo, burst into the house like a small tornado. "Happy birthday, Grandma!" they shouted in unison, then immediately ran out into the garden without even waiting for my reaction. "Kids, quiet!" Peyton called after them, but without much enthusiasm. She kissed me on the cheek and immediately began giving orders. "Mom, is the oven on? The casserole needs another 15 minutes. Ricardo, put the pot in the kitchen. And where are your gifts? Did you hide them?" I barely suppressed a sigh. Peyton had always been like that, businesslike to the point of rudeness. As a child, I thought it was a character trait, then teenage rebellion, but now I realize that's just the way she is. My daughter, who keeps her husband, children, and the entire office of the waste processing center where she works as an administrator under her thumb. Ewan appeared next, quiet and inconspicuous as always. My youngest son had inherited my traits, both in appearance and character. He was just as quiet and withdrawn. He silently handed me a box of chocolates and a bouquet of carnations, clearly bought at the supermarket on the way. "Hi, Mom." He hugged me quickly and stepped back, as if the embrace caused him physical pain. "Happy birthday." "Thank you, sweetie," I smiled at him. "How's work?" Ewan works as a taxidermist in a small workshop on the outskirts of town. Not the most common profession, but he likes it. He had always been a strange child, preferring the company of dead animals to living people. "Fine," he shrugged. "Lots of orders before hunting season." That was the extent of our conversation. Ewan had never been a talkative boy. When he was younger, I had been concerned about this and took him to see a psychologist. The psychologist said that he was simply an introvert, and there was nothing that could be done about it. Over time, I came to accept this, although I sometimes wished I knew what my youngest son was really thinking. Garrett was late, as usual. He showed up when we were already sitting at the table and Peyton was starting to get annoyed, constantly glancing at her watch. "Sorry I'm late," he said, barging through the door, smelling slightly of whiskey. He was followed by his second wife, Lauren, a petite blonde who always looked like she was apologizing for existing. "Happy birthday, Mom." Garrett hugged me too tightly, almost knocking me over. He had definitely started celebrating without us. "Thanks, Garrett." I pulled away, trying not to grimace at the smell of alcohol. "I'm glad you could make it." "We would never miss your birthday, right, Lauren?" He winked at his wife, who smiled weakly and handed me a gift bag. "This is from both of us, Mrs. Sloth," she said quietly. "I hope you like it." The bag contained a silk scarf. Beautiful, but not my style at all. I thanked them, knowing I would never wear it. Dinner began relatively peacefully. Peyton served the casserole, talking loudly about problems at work. Ricardo chewed silently, nodding occasionally when his wife looked to him for confirmation. Ewan picked at his plate, barely looking up. Lauren tried to keep the conversation polite, asking me about my backyard garden. Garrett drank. He had brought a bottle of whiskey with him, which he placed next to his plate, regularly pouring himself a drink. I watched the scene, feeling like a stranger at my own birthday party. When had my children become such strangers? When had the closeness I remembered from their childhood disappeared? After Ralph died, I had to work 2 jobs to support my family. I took any shift I could get, often leaving the children in the care of a neighbor. Peyton, being the oldest girl, learned to cook and look after her younger siblings at an early age. Garrett was always a problem child. He fought at school and skipped classes. I couldn't always give him enough attention because I was too tired from work. Ewan grew up quiet and withdrawn, preferring books to communication. I thought I was doing everything right, providing for them, giving them a roof over their heads, food and education. I thought that was enough. "Do you remember when we went to the beach in Cape May?" I asked suddenly, looking at a photo on the table. "The summer Dad was still alive?" "Vaguely," Peyton shrugged. "I remember thinking there were sharks in the ocean the whole time." "I remember Dad teaching me how to swim," Ewan said unexpectedly. He held my hands and said, "Don't be afraid, son. I won't let you go." Those were probably the longest sentences Ewan had uttered all evening. Dad always knew how to be supportive. Garrett nodded, pouring himself another glass of whiskey. Unlike some people. An awkward silence hung in the room. Lauren coughed nervously, and Peyton rolled her eyes. "Garrett, maybe that's enough?" I said quietly. "You've had enough to drink." "You always know what's best for me, don't you, Mom?" His voice took on a dangerous tone. "You always knew what I was missing. Money, food, clothes, everything except you." "Garrett, don't start," Peyton intervened. "It's Mom's birthday." "What? I don't have the right to tell the truth on my mom's birthday?" He laughed, but there was no joy in it. About how she was always at work while we were being raised by the neighbor, about how she missed my prom because she was on duty, about how she was never there when I needed her. "Garrett, please," Lauren whispered, placing her hand on his shoulder. He shook her hand off and stood up, swaying slightly. "You know, Mom," he looked me straight in the eye, and I saw so much pain and anger in them that I couldn't breathe. I always envied my friends who had normal mothers, who baked cookies, went to parent-teacher conferences, read bedtime stories. You were just a shadow, a ghost who came and went. You were never a mother to me. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp as shards of glass. I looked at my son, unable to find the words to respond. What could I say? That I had done everything I could? That after Ralph died, I had no choice? That every day I collapsed from exhaustion but got up and went to work so my children wouldn't go hungry? Garrett, you're drunk, I finally said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. You'd better leave. Oh, sure, he sneered bitterly. Kick me out, like always. Solve your problems the easy way. Brother, you really should leave, Ewan said quietly, addressing Garrett directly for the first time that evening. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Garrett raised his voice, and Peyton's children, who had been playing in the garden, fell silent, listening to the noise in the house. For the first time in a long time, I'm telling the truth. Our dear mother doesn't give a damn about any of us. She never has. Garrett, stop it! Peyton stood up, her face red with anger. You're acting like an idiot. Mom did everything she could after Dad died. She raised this family all by herself. You're defending her? Garrett looked at his sister. You who cooked dinner for us when you were 16 because she was never home? You who checked our homework because she came home too late and too tired? Don't make me laugh. Yes, I did. Peyton crossed her arms over her chest. And I'm not complaining because I understand she had no choice. There's always a choice. Garrett shook his head. She chose work over us. And you know what? I hope she's happy with her choice because I'm not going to be part of this joke of a family anymore. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. Lauren hurried after him, giving me a guilty look. I'm sorry, Mrs. Sloth. He didn't mean to. He's just upset about work and... Don't apologize for me, Garrett barked, already standing in the doorway. That's exactly what I wanted to say. The door slammed behind them, and a heavy silence hung in the room. I sat there, staring at the uneaten dinner, the gifts, my remaining children and grandchildren, who looked at me with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. Mom, don't worry about it, Peyton finally said, starting to clear the plates. You know Garrett, he's always been quick-tempered. He'll sober up tomorrow and apologize. But he didn't apologize. Not the next day, not a week later, not a month later. He just disappeared from my life as if he had never existed. Peyton mentioned him occasionally in our rare phone conversations. He was having problems at work, he had a fight with Lauren, he had started drinking again. But he never called or came by. And so a year passed, a year of loneliness, a year of reflection. I thought a lot during that time, about my life, about my decisions, about whether I was a good mother. I pored over memories like old photographs, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. Maybe Garrett was right. Maybe I was never a real mother, the kind who bakes cookies and reads bedtime stories. I was a provider, a protector. I put a roof over their heads and food on the table. But maybe that wasn't enough. I look at the rain outside the window and think that time doesn't heal all wounds. Some just get covered with a thin crust under which the pain continues to throb. The tea in my mug has long since grown cold, but I sit there, staring at the photo of a happy family on the beach, a family that no longer exists. After that memorable birthday, my life was divided into before and after. It was as if someone had drawn an invisible line separating the past from the present. I, Marilyn Sloth, a 68-year-old woman, suddenly found myself completely alone. Of course, technically I still had my children, Peyton and Ewan, grandchildren. But the spark that bound the family together had been extinguished. Garrett had extinguished it with his cruel words, and now we all pretended that nothing had happened, even though everyone felt that something irreparable had been done. For the first few weeks after the argument, I waited. I waited for Garrett to come to his senses, to call, to apologize. I even rehearsed our conversation in front of the bathroom mirror. Yes, I understand, you were drunk. Of course, I forgive you. The phone was silent. I checked it 10 times a day, but the screen remained dark. Peyton called a couple of times a week. She asked how I was doing in a businesslike manner, talked about the children and work, but didn't mention Garrett. Ewan stopped by every 2 weeks, brought groceries, drank tea in silence, and left, as if fulfilling a duty. I felt like I had become an obligation for my children, a checkmark on my to-do list. Call Mom. Visit Mom. Make sure Mom is still alive. By the end of the first month, I realized that Garrett wasn't going to call. His words weren't drunken ramblings. They had been building up inside him for a long time, and alcohol had only helped them come out. This realization hit me harder than the words themselves had that evening. My son really believed that I wasn't his mother, and it seemed that nothing could change his mind. That morning, for the first time in years of working, I didn't get up at dawn. I lay in bed until noon, staring at the ceiling and thinking, why bother getting up? Who needs me? Who's waiting for me to make breakfast, clean the house, trim the roses in the garden? I was brought out of my stupor by the doorbell. Standing on the doorstep was Vinnie Carson, my neighbor, a tall, thin woman with short gray hair and piercing blue eyes. A former math teacher, she had retired 5 years before me and now kept herself busy with community work and gardening. "Marilyn, are you all right?" she asked without preamble, looking me up and down. "I haven't seen you in a week. Your curtains have been drawn all the time." I stammered, not knowing what to say. To say I was fine would have been an obvious lie. I stood in the doorway in an old robe, my hair uncombed and my eyes swollen from crying. "I'm going through a rough patch, Vinnie." "I can see that." She nodded and walked resolutely past me into the house. "Put the kettle on. We need to talk." I obeyed mechanically. Strangely, Winnie's commanding tone didn't annoy me the way Peyton's did. Maybe it was because there was no judgment in Winnie's voice, only genuine concern. We sat in the kitchen drinking tea, and I told her everything. Everything from beginning to end, about the fight with Garrett, how hard it had been for me after Ralph's death, my guilt for not being a perfect mother. Vinnie listened without interrupting, only nodding occasionally. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, stirring sugar in her cup. "You know, Marilyn," she finally said, "I've never been married. I don't have children, but I've taught them. Hundreds of other people's children over 35 years of working at a school. And I've learned something. Children are selfish, not out of malice, but by nature. They are simply incapable of fully understanding that their parents are also human beings, with their own weaknesses, problems, and pain." "But Garrett is 44, I objected. "He's not a child anymore." "Emotionally, some people never grow up," Winnie shrugged, "especially in relationships with their parents. To him, you'll always be mom with a capital M, the one who has to be perfect, all-powerful, and forgiving. And when reality doesn't match that image, disappointment sets in." I thought about her words. Maybe there was some truth to them. Garrett had always been the most demanding of my children, the loudest, the most intense, the most emotional. Even as a child, he would throw tantrums over the slightest thing. "What am I supposed to do now?" I asked, feeling helpless. "Live," Vinnie replied simply. "Not for them, but for yourself. You've given 36 years to your work and your children. Now it's your time." Easy to say, much harder to do. After Vinnie left, I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway for a long time, looking at my reflection. I didn't like what I saw. Slumped shoulders, dull eyes, wrinkles that seemed to have multiplied over the last month. This wasn't me. Not the Marilyn Sloat who had raised 3 children on her own while working 2 jobs. Not the woman who had held on when the world around her was falling apart. The next day, I made an appointment to get my hair cut. Then I bought some new clothes. For the first time in years, not at a discount store, but at a boutique where the sales assistant helped me choose items that flattered my figure and hid my flaws. I threw out my old robe and bought a new one, silk, in a beautiful turquoise color. These small changes in my appearance had a strange effect on my inner state. I began to feel visible. Not like a ghost wandering around the house, but like a living person. Vinnie came by regularly now. We drank tea, discussed books, the news, and our neighbors. Sometimes we went shopping or to a cafe together. She told me about her former students, how one of them now works at NASA and another has become a famous writer. I shared stories from the hospital about patients who came to after anesthesia and said funny things, about young doctors who were afraid of blood, about difficult operations and miraculous rescues. At the end of autumn, Winnie invited me to join a book club that met at the local library every Thursday. I agreed, although I found it difficult to imagine myself among strangers. But it turned out that most of the club members were retirees like me. They welcomed me warmly, without asking any unnecessary questions. We read classics and contemporary literature, discussing plots and characters. I discovered that I enjoyed analyzing what I read, looking for hidden meanings, and arguing about the characters' motives. It made my brain work and distracted me from sad thoughts. Winnie often said, "You see, Marilyn, life doesn't end with children. It only begins when you finally have time for yourself." Maybe she was right. Gradually, I began to find joy in the little things, in a cup of good coffee in the morning, in a new book, in a walk in the park when the air smelled of autumn leaves. I signed up for watercolor painting classes, even though I had never held a paintbrush before. My first attempts were terrible, but the instructor, a kind woman my age, said I had a good sense of color. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Peyton still called, and Ewan stopped by occasionally. On Thanksgiving, I declined Peyton's invitation, citing a cold. In reality, I simply couldn't imagine a family dinner without Garrett. No arguments, no words from him, no heavy atmosphere that would now inevitably arise whenever we met. I spent Christmas at Vinnie's. She invited a few other neighbors, and we had a pleasant evening with wine and conversation. No one yelled, cried, or brought up old grievances. It was peaceful. Not perfect, not magical, but peaceful. And at that moment, I realized that peace was what I had always lacked. All my life I had been running, from work to home, from one crisis to another, from one problem to the next. Now I could allow myself to stop and just breathe. In January, Peyton called with unexpected news. "Mom, Garrett's in trouble," she said without preamble. My heart sank. Despite everything that had happened, he was still my son. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "He got fired from the factory." "Something to do with a safety violation. He says it's unfair that he's being made the scapegoat, but—" She trailed off. "Anyway, he's been out of work for 3 months. Lauren says he's started drinking heavily again." I closed my eyes. Garrett had always had a problem with alcohol, but he usually kept it under control. Apparently, losing his job was the last straw. "Is there anything I can do to help?" I asked automatically, even though I knew the answer. "No," Peyton sighed. "He doesn't want anyone's help, especially yours. I just thought you should know." After that conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about Garrett. I imagined him sitting in his little house on the outskirts of Cherry Hill, drinking whiskey and angry at the world. I imagined Lauren trying to calm him down and getting cursed at in return. I imagined him looking for work, but with his history and alcohol problems, it was becoming increasingly difficult. Several times I was tempted to call him, but each time I stopped myself. He had made it clear that he didn't want to see me. My call would only make things worse. Spring came early that year. The first flowers were already blooming at the end of February, and I spent a lot of time in the garden preparing it for the new season. Working with the soil was calming and gave me a sense of control that I so desperately lacked in my relationships with my children. In March, Ewan showed up unannounced. He looked troubled and was nervously fiddling with his car keys. "Mom, I have to tell you something," he began, declining my offer of tea. "It's about Garrett." I tensed up. My first thought was that he'd been in an accident or in the hospital or in jail. "What's wrong with him?" "He's physically fine." Ewan shook his head as if reading my mind. "But he's really bad, Mom. Lauren left him 2 weeks ago. She said she couldn't live like this anymore. He drinks constantly and hardly eats." I tried to talk to him, but he kicked me out, said he didn't need anyone. I sat there clutching my cup of cold tea. My eldest son was spiraling out of control, and there was nothing I could do. Or was there? "Maybe he needs professional help," I suggested cautiously. "A rehab center," I suggested. "He said he'd rather die than let anyone mess with his head." Ewan shrugged. That was so like Garrett. Proud, stubborn, unwilling to admit his weaknesses. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked bluntly. "You know he won't accept my help." Ewan was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the wind swaying the branches of an old apple tree. "I don't know, Mom," he finally said. "I just thought you should know. He is your son, after all." After Ewan left, I sat on the porch for a long time staring at the street. Neighbors were returning from work. Children were playing on the lawns. Life was going on as usual. And somewhere out there, my son was slowly killing himself, and I couldn't find a way to help him. That night, I dreamed about Ralph. He was standing in our old kitchen, as young and handsome as the day we met. "You can't save them from themselves, Mary," he said, using the nickname he had given me. "They have to want to be saved." I woke up with my cheeks wet from tears and a strange feeling of relief. Ralph was right, even in my dream. I couldn't save Garrett if he didn't want to be saved. All I could do was be ready to help when he was ready to accept help. Spring turned to summer. I continued going to book club, painting watercolors, and working in the garden. On the outside, my life was calm and measured. But inside, I was always worried about Garrett. I heard about him through Peyton and Ewan. He had finally found a job at a warehouse, stopped drinking, but refused to talk to his family. In July, Vinny suggested that I go with her for the weekend to the ocean, to Cape May, where Ralph and I had once vacationed with the children. I hesitated. That town held too many memories. But then I decided that maybe it was time to make new ones. We rented a small house by the sea for 3 days. The weather was beautiful, warm but not hot, with a light breeze from the ocean. We walked on the beach, ate ice cream like children, and visited little souvenir shops. On the last evening, sitting on the porch with a glass of wine, I suddenly realized that I was happy. Not the intense, vibrant joy I had felt in my youth, but the quiet, peaceful happiness of someone who had finally found their place in the world. "What are you thinking about?" Vinny asked, noticing my mood. "About how strange life is," I replied honestly. "A year ago, I thought my life was over, that without children, I was nothing, and now I realize that I've only just begun to truly live." Winnie smiled but said nothing. She always knew when words were unnecessary. At the end of August, Peyton called. Her voice sounded tense. "Mom, are you sitting down?" she asked without preamble. "Yes," I replied. I was indeed sitting in my chair by the window, looking at my latest watercolor, a landscape of Cape May that I had painted from memory. "What's wrong?" "It's Garrett," she stammered, and my heart sank. "He's having health problems, serious ones." I listened as she explained. Chest pains, fainting spells at work, finally a visit to the doctor and a diagnosis. A serious heart condition that required surgery, expensive surgery that his insurance only partially covers. "Does he know you're telling me this?" I asked when she finished. "No," Peyton admitted. "He'd kill me if he found out. But Mom, I don't know what to do. He doesn't have that kind of money." Ricardo and I don't either. Ewan is barely making ends meet. She didn't ask directly, but the implication was clear. I was the only one who could help. Over the years, I had saved a decent amount of money, not a fortune, but enough to live comfortably in retirement, and perhaps enough for Garrett's surgery. "I'll think about it," I said after a pause, "but he has to ask me himself. I'm not going to force my help on him." "But Mom, you know how proud he is," Peyton protested. "He'd rather die than ask you for money after everything he's said." "Then that's his choice," I said, trying to sound firm, even though I felt sick at the thought that my son might die because of his pride. "I can't force him to accept my help." Peyton muttered something about stubbornness, which was apparently a family trait, and hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. Part of me wanted to call Garrett immediately, to tell him I knew everything and was ready to help. But another part of me knew it would be wrong. He had to take that step himself. The next 2 weeks were spent in anxious anticipation. I slept poorly, constantly checking my phone. Vinny noticed my state, but delicately refrained from asking questions, only suggesting that I distract myself. Go to the movies, to an exhibition, or just take a walk. One day, when I returned from a walk, I saw a familiar car in the driveway of my house. It was the old black Ford that Garrett had bought before his divorce from his first wife. My heart pounded so hard that for a moment I was afraid I was having a heart attack. Garrett was sitting on the porch, slumped over and staring at the ground. He looked terrible, thin, pale, with sunken eyes and stubble that was already turning into a beard. When he heard my footsteps, he looked up, and I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before. Fear. "Hi, Mom," he said hoarsely, and those 2 words conveyed so much. Pain, pride, fear, hope. "Hi, Garrett," I said, trying to sound calm, though I wanted to scream or cry. "Long time no see." He nodded, nervously licking his lips. "I need your help," he finally said, looking me straight in the eyes. I know I have no right to ask. I know I've been a complete jerk, but I have no one else to turn to. I looked at my son, a big, strong man who now looked so vulnerable, so human. And I realized that this might be our chance, a chance to start over. I looked at Garrett sitting on my porch and tried to make sense of what was happening. My son, who a year ago had said I was never his mother, had now come to ask for my help. Life was full of irony. "Let's go inside," I said, taking out my keys. "It's getting cold." He followed me silently. In the living room, Garrett sank down on the sofa, wrapping his arms around his head. I noticed his fingers trembling. This was not like my usually loud and confident son. "Tea? Coffee?" I offered, not knowing how to start the conversation. "No thanks." He looked up at me. "Mom, I need money. For an operation." Straightforwardness had always been his trait. No preamble, no apologies for a year of silence. Straight to the point. "I'm listening," I said, sitting down in the armchair opposite him. Peyton had already told me the basics, but I wanted to hear it from him. Garrett took a deep breath, as if gathering his strength. 2 months ago, I started having chest pains. At first, I thought it was just stress or something with my stomach. You know, I've never had any health problems. I nodded. Garrett had always been in excellent health. When he was a child, Peyton and Ewan had chicken pox, but somehow he managed not to catch it, even though he slept in the same room as them. Then the dizziness started. One day I just passed out in the warehouse. I woke up in an ambulance. The doctors ran a bunch of tests and he faltered, his voice shaking. "I have some kind of rare heart defect. They say I was probably born with it, but it just hadn't manifested itself until now. Now I need surgery. Expensive surgery." I listened, and everything inside me tightened. My son, my big, strong son, was seriously ill. Of course, Peyton had warned me, but hearing it from Garrett himself was completely different. "How much?" I asked. $28,000, he replied, not looking at me. "My insurance only covers part of it. It's not very good." The warehouse where he worked was unlikely to offer a decent insurance plan, especially to an employee with a history of being fired from his previous job. "I can help," I said after a pause. "I have savings." Garrett looked up at me, his eyes full of surprise and disbelief. "Just like that? You'll give me money after everything I've told you?" "You're my son, Garrett," I shrugged, trying to sound calm, even though I was a mess inside. "No matter what." He was silent for a long time, staring at the floor. Then he said quietly, "I don't know if I can pay you back. At least not quickly." "We'll talk about that later," I said, standing up. "Right now, your health is more important. Are you hungry? I have some soup." That's how our awkward reunion began. Garrett ate my chicken soup, answered questions about how he was feeling, but avoided any talk about the past year, about our fight, about the words he had said that still echoed in my head. However, I didn't try to bring up those topics either. Maybe it wasn't the right time. Before he left, he awkwardly hugged me, the first time in years. He smelled sour, then cheap cologne, but I held him tight, not wanting to let go. "Thanks, Mom," he mumbled into my shoulder. "I'll call you about the details." And he left, leaving me with a lump in my throat and 1,000 questions. I knew about his diagnosis, about the need for surgery, but how did he get to this point? How did he feel when he found out about his illness? How did he decide to turn to me? The next day I couldn't take it anymore and called Lauren, his wife, or rather, his ex-wife, as I learned from Peyton. But she was the one who could tell me what Garrett hadn't. "Mrs. Sloot?" Her voice sounded surprised. "Garrett was at your place?" "Yes, yesterday," I confirmed. "He told me about his illness and the operation, but I'd like to know more. How is he really?" Lauren was silent for a long time, and I thought she was going to hang up. But then she spoke, and there was so much fatigue and pain in her voice that I felt a pang of guilt. This young woman was carrying a burden that should have been shared by Garrett's family. My family. "He's in terrible shape, Mrs. Sloot," she finally said. "Not just physically. When Dr. Holder told him the diagnosis, Garrett just broke down. I've never seen him like this. He's always been so strong, so invincible. And now, suddenly, his heart could stop at any moment. I listened as Lauren described the day they learned the diagnosis. The cardiologist's office with its cold white light and posters of hearts on the walls. Dr. Holder, young, too young to be delivering such serious news, explaining in complicated medical terms that Garrett had a ventricular septal defect complicated by aortic valve stenosis, that it was a congenital defect that had miraculously never manifested itself before. Now that it had manifested itself, urgent surgery was required. He didn't want to believe it, Lauren continued. He demanded a second opinion, then a third. We saw 5 cardiologists, and they all said the same thing, but he still couldn't accept it. He said it was a mistake, that he was fine. Denial is the first stage of accepting the inevitable. I saw it many times in the hospital when I worked there. Patients who were given terrible diagnoses always refused to believe it at first. And then? I asked, when Lauren fell silent. Then there was anger, she said with a bitter smile. He was angry at everyone. The doctors, himself, the whole world. But most of all, he was angry at his body for letting him down. He screamed that it wasn't fair, that he was only 44, that he had his whole life ahead of him. And then he started drinking. Every day. He said that if he was going to die anyway, he might as well have fun. I closed my eyes. I knew this side of Garrett too well, his desire to drown his problems in alcohol. He started drinking in high school after his father died. I was too busy to notice at the time, too exhausted from work and taking care of my younger children. By the time I finally realized what was going on, it was too late. Alcohol had become his way of coping with life. "And you left," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "Yes," she replied, her voice free of accusation, only tired. I couldn't watch him destroy himself anymore. I offered him help, therapy, support groups, anything. But he refused. He said he could handle it himself, and then the money started to run out. I listened as Lauren recounted the last weeks of their life together, about how Garrett lost his job because he was often out sick or just didn't show up because of a hangover, about how they started getting into debt paying for medical bills, about how she found him once on the bathroom floor, unconscious, foaming at the mouth. It wasn't his first seizure, Lauren said, but it was the worst. I called an ambulance and they took him to the hospital. Dr. Holder said that if he didn't have surgery in the next few months, Garrett might not live to see another year. I clenched the phone so hard that my knuckles turned white. My son could have died, and I didn't even know it. When I left, he already knew the final cost of the surgery, Lauren continued. $28,000. That was an impossible amount of money for us. I offered to sell the house, take out a loan, anything. But he refused. He said he'd rather die than owe the bank for the rest of his life, which he said wouldn't be long anyway. "And you suggested he come to me," I guessed. "Yes," Lauren admitted. "He refused categorically. He said you weren't talking to him, that it was over between you. But I knew you had savings. Peyton mentioned it once. Of course Peyton knew about my savings. She was always interested in the financial situation of all family members. Not out of greed, but out of her love of order and control. I'm glad he finally decided," I said after a pause. "I'll help him. The money will be fine." "Thank you, Mrs. Sloth." Lauren's voice trembled. "I know you and Garrett have a complicated relationship, but he's a good man." "He's just confused." After talking to Lauren, I sat for a long time looking out the window at my garden, where the leaves were already beginning to turn yellow. My son was on the verge of death, and only I could help him. What irony of fate. The day Garrett came to ask for help was cloudy. Heavy leaden clouds covered the sky, promising rain. I was just finishing replanting the chrysanthemums when I heard the sound of a car pulling up. I recognized Garrett's old black Ford immediately. He had bought it before his divorce from his first wife and stubbornly refused to replace it, despite its constant breakdowns. I put down my gardening gloves and stood up straight, watching my son slowly get out of the car. Even from a distance, I could see how haggard and pale he looked. His shoulders, always broad, now seemed slumped, as if weighed down by an invisible burden. "Hi, Mom," he said hoarsely as he came closer. His eyes, usually as blue and bright as his father's, now seemed dull and sunken. "Hello, Garrett." I tried to say calmly, though my heart was beating so hard that he must have been able to hear it. It's been a long time. Yes, he nodded, nervously rubbing his neck, a gesture he had picked up from Ralph. Almost a year. An awkward silence hung between us. Neither of us knew how to start the conversation, how to bridge the gap that had formed after those terrible words on my birthday. "Why don't we go inside?" I finally suggested. "It looks like it's going to rain." He followed me silently. In the living room, Garrett awkwardly sat down on the sofa, the very one where, a year ago, he had uttered the words that changed our lives. I sat down opposite him, in the armchair that had once belonged to Ralph. Strange, but now, looking at our son, I felt my husband's absence particularly keenly. Ralph always knew how to get through to Garrett better than I did. They were so alike, both quick-tempered, passionate, emotional. "Would you like some tea? Coffee?" I asked, not knowing where to start. "No thanks," Garrett shook his head. He looked so lost, so young, despite the gray in his hair and the wrinkles around his eyes. "Mom, I need to talk to you." "I'm listening," I said, folding my hands in my lap, trying to stop them from shaking. Whatever he was about to say, I had to hear it calmly, without interrupting. Garrett took a deep breath, as if gathering his strength. "I'm sick, Mom," he finally said. "Seriously sick." Although Peyton had already told me about his diagnosis, hearing it from Garrett himself was completely different. I felt something inside me grow cold. "What's wrong?" I tried to keep my voice steady, but it still trembled. "My heart." He smiled weakly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Ironic, isn't it? I've always thought of myself as heartless, and now I'm dying because of my heart. "Don't say that." I leaned forward. "You're not dying." "I'll die if I don't have the operation." He shrugged with a feigned nonchalance that couldn't fool me. I knew my son too well. He always joked when he was scared. And the operation costs money. A lot of money. "How much?" I got down to business, realizing that was why he had come. $28,000, he said without looking at me. "My insurance only covers part of it. It's not very good." I nodded. The warehouse where he currently worked was unlikely to offer a decent insurance plan, especially to an employee with his history. "I have savings," I said after a pause. "I can help." Garrett looked up at me, his eyes full of surprise and disbelief. "Just like that?" He frowned. "You'll give me money after everything I said?" I shrugged. "You're my son, Garrett, no matter what." He stared at me for a long time, as if trying to solve some complicated puzzle. Then he asked quietly, "Why? Why are you doing this?" I could have said many beautiful words about maternal love, about forgiveness, about how families should support each other in difficult times. But instead, I simply told him the truth. "Because I don't want you to die thinking that I didn't love you." His face twitched, and for a moment I thought he was going to cry. But Garrett quickly pulled himself together and turned away to the window, where the first raindrops were already tapping against the glass. "I didn't think you didn't love me," he finally said, still not looking at me. "I knew you did. In your own way. It just wasn't enough." His words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, no, they were simply the naked truth. I did love my children, but perhaps not in the way they needed. "I did everything I could, Garrett," I said quietly. "After your father died." "I know," he interrupted, finally turning to face me. "You worked 2 jobs, saved every penny, provided us with everything we needed. I know, Mom. I know that now. But back then, that's not what I needed." "What did you need?" I asked, afraid to hear the answer. "I needed you to be there," he replied simply. "I needed you to listen when I spoke. I needed you to see me, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person who needed understanding." I closed my eyes, feeling a lump rise in my throat. He was right. I had always viewed my children's problems as tasks to be solved, quickly, efficiently, so we could move on. I simply didn't have time for long conversations, for sorting out feelings, for just being there. "I'm sorry," I said, opening my eyes and looking at him. "I'm really sorry, Garrett. I wasn't a perfect mother." "Who's perfect?" He smiled grimly. "I wasn't the perfect son either, especially this past year." We fell silent again. The rain intensified, drumming on the roof with increasing force. There was something soothing about the sound, something that made our difficult conversation a little easier. "I shouldn't have said those things on your birthday," Garrett said suddenly. "I was drunk and angry, but that's no excuse. I'm sorry." It was the first real apology I had heard from him in years. Not sorry I was late or sorry I forgot to call, but a sincere, deep regret for the pain he had caused. "I know," I nodded, "and I accept your apology." "That simple?" He raised his eyebrows in surprise. "That's simple," I confirmed. "Life's too short for long grudges, Garrett. I've learned that over the last year." He looked at me for a long time, as if seeing me for the first time. Then he said quietly, "You've changed, Mom." "Everyone changes," I smiled weakly. "Even at my age." "No, I mean," he paused, searching for the right words. "You seem more calm, confident. You used to be so tense, always rushing somewhere, always worrying about something." I thought about it. He was right. The last year had changed me. Life without the constant need to live up to someone else's expectations, as a mother, as a nurse, as someone else, had given me the freedom to be myself. For the first time in many years, I was living at my own pace, doing what I wanted without looking over my shoulder. "Maybe," I agreed. "I've had time to think about a lot of things this year." "And?" He tilted his head, looking at me with genuine interest. "What conclusions have you come to?" I thought about it. How could I explain to him everything I had learned during this year of solitude? How could I tell him about those long nights when I lay awake, rethinking my whole life? About those conversations with Vinny that helped me see myself from the outside? About those moments of insight that came suddenly, in the middle of the most mundane tasks? I realized that I've been so busy taking care of others my whole life that I forgot to take care of myself, I finally said. My desires, my needs, my dreams. I was a nurse, a mother, a widow. But who am I really? What do I love? What do I hate? What do I want out of life? I had never asked myself these questions. Garrett listened to me with unusual attention. He was usually so impatient, always ready to interrupt and give his opinion. But now he just listened, and I saw something new in his eyes. Respect? "And what do you love?" he asked when I fell silent. I smiled. "It turns out I love to paint. Who would have thought? At 68, I picked up a paintbrush and discovered that it brings me joy. I love to read, not medical journals like I used to, but novels, poetry, philosophy. I love sitting in the garden and just watching the birds, the clouds, the way the light changes throughout the day." "That sounds peaceful," Garrett said thoughtfully. "That is peace," I nodded. "For the first time in many years, I feel at peace within myself. And you know what? I think it makes me a better mother than I was before. Because now I can give you what I couldn't before. Peace of mind, attention, time." Garrett was silent for a long time, thinking about my words. Then he said quietly, "You know, when the doctor told me the diagnosis, my first thought was, I don't want to die without making peace with my mother. Not about Lauren, not about work, not about money. About you." His confession touched me deeply. Despite all our arguments, all the misunderstandings, all the years of hurt feelings, we were still a family. We still needed each other. "I'm glad you came," I said sincerely, "no matter the reason." "Even if the reason is money?" He smiled crookedly, and for a moment I saw the teenager who had always used sarcasm as a shield against vulnerability. "Even if it is," I shrugged. "Money is just money, Garrett. It's not worth our separation." He nodded, but I could see he was still uncomfortable with the situation. Pride had always been his weak spot. Accepting help, especially financial help, had always been difficult for him. "I'll pay you back, Yimsang," he said firmly. "Every penny. As soon as I'm able to work after the surgery, I'll find a good job and pay you back every month." "No, you don't," I shook my head. "It's not a loan, Garrett. It's a gift. From a mother to her son. But I can't just take that kind of money," he insisted stubbornly. "It's too much." "You can." I was just as stubborn. "And you know why? Because if our roles were reversed, if I needed help, You would do the same, wouldn't you? He thought about it, then slowly nodded. Yes, I would, but it's different. You're my mother, and you're my son. I smiled. That's all there is to it. We fell silent again, but now it was no longer awkward, but comfortable. Outside, the rain gradually subsided, and the first rays of sun began to break through the thinning clouds. So you'll give me the money? Garrett finally asked, still a little uncertain. Yes, I nodded, but I need time to get everything organized. I can't get that kind of money right away. How much time do we have before the operation? 2 weeks, he replied. Dr. Holder says it's best not to wait. Okay, I'll make it, I said, getting up. Now you need to eat. I made lasagna. Mom, you don't have to, he started, but I was already heading to the kitchen. You do, I said firmly over my shoulder. You've lost weight, and it's not the kind of weight loss that's good for you. You need your strength for the operation. To my surprise, Garrett didn't argue. He obediently followed me into the kitchen and sat down at the table, watching me heat up the food and set the table. There was something new in his eyes, a mixture of surprise, gratitude, and slight confusion, as if he didn't quite understand what was happening. Over dinner, we talked about his illness, the upcoming surgery, and Dr. Holder, whom I had decided to check out through my former colleagues at the hospital. Garrett was surprised that I was still in touch with the medical community. 36 years in one place isn't just a job, I explained. It's part of life. Many of my colleagues have become friends. You never talked about your friends, Garrett remarked, chewing his lasagna thoughtfully. I always thought you didn't have any, that you were always alone. His words made me think. It was true that I rarely talked to my children about my life outside the home, about my relationships with my colleagues, about the little joys and problems at work. Maybe that's what made them think I was some kind of one-dimensional figure, an eternally tired mother who came home only to cook dinner and check homework. I had friends, I said quietly. I just rarely found the time to see them outside of work. There were always more important things to do, you, the house, the bills. You never did anything for yourself, did you? There was a note in Garrett's voice that I had never heard before. Regret? I didn't think I had time, I shrugged. There was always something more urgent, more important. And now? He looked up at me. Are you doing something for yourself now? Yes, I smiled. Right now, I'm learning to be selfish. In a good way. After dinner, Garrett helped me clear the table. Another new thing. He had never offered to help around the house before, considering it women's work. Apparently, life had taught him a thing or two over the past year. I have to go, he said, looking at his watch. It's late, and I have to work tomorrow. Are you still at the warehouse? I asked, walking him to the door. Yes, he nodded. It's not the best job, but I don't have a choice, especially now that I'm on probation. I wanted to ask him what had happened at his previous job, why he had lost his position as a safety inspector at a chemical plant, but decided it could wait. We had already touched on some difficult topics today. At the door, Garrett shifted awkwardly from foot to foot, clearly unsure how to say goodbye. Should he hug me? Shake my hand? Just nod? I decided for him, stepping forward and hugging him tightly. He tensed for a moment, then relaxed and hugged me back. Thanks, Mom, he muttered into my shoulder, for everything. You're welcome, I said, stepping back and looking him in the eyes. Will you call me tomorrow? Tell me how your conversation with Dr. Holder went? Of course. He nodded, and I saw a mixture of surprise and gratitude in his eyes. Apparently, he hadn't expected me to show such interest in the details of his treatment. After Garrett left, I sat in the living room for a long time, looking at a photo of our family on the beach. Me, Ralph, and 3 little kids, all so happy, so carefree. Who could have known then that life would turn out this way? That Ralph would die young, that I would raise the children alone, that such deep rifts would develop between us. The ringing of the phone snapped me out of my reverie. It was Peyton, businesslike and straightforward as always. Mom, was Garrett at your place? He said he was coming over, but I wasn't sure he would. Yes, he was, I confirmed. We talked. And? Her voice sounded impatient. Are you going to give him the money? Yes, I nodded, though she couldn't see me. I will. Good. I could almost hear her mentally crossing that off her to-do list. Did he tell you everything about his illness? That he needs the surgery right away?" "Yes, Peyton, he told me everything," I sighed. My daughter had always been like that, controlling, making sure everything went according to plan. "Don't worry, I'll take care of everything." "I'm not worried," she snorted. But I knew that wasn't true. Peyton always worried about everything and everyone. She just didn't show it. "I just wanted to make sure you knew." After talking to Peyton, I couldn't sleep for a long time. I thought about Garrett, his illness, and the upcoming surgery. I thought about how strange life was. Sometimes you have to almost die to realize what's really important. The next day, I went to the bank. Withdrawing such a large sum of money turned out to be more complicated than I expected. I needed additional documents, confirmations, and explanations. But by the end of the week, I had the money in my hands, in the form of a check that I could give directly to the hospital. Garrett called every day to tell me about his preparations for the operation, his meetings with Dr. Holder, and his tests and exams. I could hear the fear in his voice, which he tried to hide behind jokes and feigned bravado. My son was afraid of dying, and that made him so vulnerable, so human. Over the weekend, he came to see me again, this time with Lauren. They hadn't gotten back together, but she promised to be there for the surgery and recovery. I was grateful to her for that. Garrett needed support, and not just financial. The three of us sat on the porch, drinking tea and discussing the upcoming surgery. As a physical therapist, Lauren knew more about medical procedures and was able to explain some of the things that were worrying Garrett. "You'll need to rest a lot after the surgery," she said. "No physical activity for at least 6 weeks. And no alcohol, Garrett, none at all." "I know," he said impatiently. "Dr. Holder already gave me the lecture." "It doesn't hurt to repeat it," I said gently. "The post-operative period is very important for a successful recovery." Garrett looked at me with slight surprise. "You sound just like a nurse." "I am a nurse," I smiled. "A former one, but some things you never forget." "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I never thought of your work as something meaningful. To me, it was just something that took you away from us. But now I realize you were doing important work. You were helping people, saving lives." His words touched me. In all my years working at the hospital, none of my children had ever expressed an interest in what I did, asked about my patients, my successes, or my challenges. It was as if that part of my life simply didn't exist for them. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That means a lot to me." After Garrett and Lauren left, I sat on the porch for a long time thinking about our conversation, about how much misunderstanding there had been between us all these years, about how we had all taken each other for granted, never really trying to get to know, understand, or accept each other. Maybe Garrett's illness, tragic as it was a blessing in disguise, a chance to start over, to build a new relationship based not on obligation and guilt, but on mutual respect and understanding. I didn't know, but I was willing to try. For Garrett, for myself, for the family we could have been, if only we gave ourselves that chance. That evening, Vinny called. She was the only one I told about Garrett's illness and my decision to help him. "How are you?" she asked without preamble. "How did the meeting go?" "Better than I expected," I replied honestly. "We talked. We really talked, Vinny. Maybe for the first time in years." "That's good," she said approvingly. "What's next?" "I don't know," I sighed. "The operation is in 10 days. I'll give him the money, and then we'll see." "You still haven't decided whether to forgive him or not?" Vinny asked perceptively. I thought about it. Did I forgive Garrett for those terrible words, for a year of silence, for all the hurt he had caused me over the years? Or was I just helping him out of a sense of duty, out of maternal instinct, out of fear of losing my son forever? "I think I've forgiven him," I said slowly. "But there's a difference between forgiving and forgetting. I can't pretend that his words didn't hurt me, that this year of loneliness hasn't changed me, but I can accept that pain as part of our history and move on." "That's a wise approach," Vinny approved. "What about him? Did he apologize?" "Yes," I nodded, remembering Garrett's awkward but sincere words. "In his own way. Not directly, but I feel like he's sorry." "Sometimes that's the most we can get," Vinny remarked philosophically. especially from men. They're rarely good at admitting their mistakes openly. We talked a little more about our plans for the weekend, about the new book we were discussing in our club, about the upcoming exhibition of watercolors by local artists, where my work was also to be featured, the usual everyday topics that now made up the fabric of my life. But my thoughts kept returning to Garrett, to his illness, to our conversation. When I finally went to bed, I dreamed about Ralph. He was standing in our old kitchen, as young and handsome as the day we met. "You can't save them from themselves, Mary," he said, using the nickname he had given me once. "They have to want to be saved." I woke up with my cheeks wet from tears and a strange feeling of relief. Ralph was right. Even in my dream, I couldn't save Garrett if he didn't want to be saved. All I could do was be ready to help when he was ready to accept help. And now that moment had come. Garrett was ready to accept my help, not just financial, but emotional as well. He was ready to be a part of my life again, to let me be a part of his. It was the first step on a long road to repairing our relationship. But was I ready? A year ago, his words had broken my heart. I had built a new life from the fragments of my old one, a quiet, measured life with no room for drama or conflict. Was I ready to let my troubled, emotional, unpredictable son back into that life? With all his problems, his pain, his anger? That morning, I sat in the garden for a long time, watching the sunlight play on the dewdrops, the light breeze rustling the leaves of the apple tree that Ralph and I had planted the year Garrett was born. What would Ralph have said if he were here? What would he have done in my place? I knew the answer. Ralph had always been straightforward, honest, and unconditionally loving. He wouldn't have hesitated for a second. He would have hugged his son, told him everything would be okay, and done everything in his power to make that true. But I'm not Ralph. I've always been more cautious, more reserved in showing my feelings, more protective. Maybe that was what had created the distance between me and my children that Garrett felt so painfully. I took out my phone and dialed Garrett's number. He answered after the third ring, his voice sounding sleepy. "Mom, is something wrong?" "No." I took a deep breath. "I just wanted to say I love you, Garrett. I always have and always will, no matter what." There was silence on the line. I was starting to think the connection had been lost when I heard his quiet, slightly trembling voice. "I love you too, Mom." 3 simple words. 3 words we so rarely said to each other. 3 words that could have changed so much if we had said them more often. "I'll come over tonight," he said after a pause. "I want to show you all the hospital paperwork, and maybe we could have dinner together?" "Sure," I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "I'll make your favorite lasagna." "Sounds great," he said, a smile creeping into his voice. "See you tonight, Mom." "See you tonight, son." I hung up and looked at the apple tree, at the house, at the garden I had lovingly tended all year. My life was changing again, but this time I was ready for the changes. I was ready to open my heart, my home, my life to the son who needed me more than ever. I didn't know what the future would bring. Would Garrett make a full recovery? Would we be able to truly mend our relationship? Would our family be whole again? But I knew one thing. I would no longer hide behind a wall of obligations and routine. I would be present, truly present, in the lives of my children and grandchildren. Because in the end, isn't that what motherhood is all about? Not money, not advice, not solving problems, but simply being there, unconditionally. Being ready to be there, no matter what, no matter how difficult it might be. I returned home and started cooking lasagna. My hands moved automatically while my thoughts wandered far away. I thought about my life, my choices, the paths that had led me here, to this moment, about what it means to be a mother, about what it means to forgive, about what it means to be a family. And I realized that I didn't have answers to all these questions. Maybe there aren't any. Absolute, universal answers. Maybe each of us has to find our own through trial and error, through pain and joy, through separations and reunions. But I was ready to search. Together with Garrett, with Peyton, with Ewan. Together with my family, imperfect as it was. The day of the operation was surprisingly sunny. I woke up early, long before the alarm went off, and lay there for a long time, watching the first rays of sunlight filter through the curtains, painting patterns on the walls of my bedroom. The decision to help Garrett wasn't as easy as it might have seemed from the outside. It wasn't about the money. I'd saved enough over 36 years working at the hospital. It was about the terms. I didn't want to just pay the bill and go back to our old relationship, cold, formal, filled with unspoken resentments. The night before the operation, I invited Garrett to dinner. Not to my house, but to a small restaurant in downtown Cherry Hill. It's easier to talk about difficult things on neutral ground. "I'll pay for your surgery," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "But I have one condition." Garrett tensed up. He was expecting anything from a demand to pay back the money with interest to moving in with me under my supervision. "What is it?" he asked warily. "Honesty," I replied simply. "Between us. No secrets, no fake smiles at family dinners, no everything's fine when it's not." He looked at me for a long time as if he were seeing me for the first time. "That's all?" he finally asked. "No demands for the money back? No obligation to come over for lunch every Sunday?" "None." I shook my head. "Just honesty, and a willingness to try to understand each other. Really understand, not just pretend." Garrett nodded slowly. "I think I can do that," he said quietly. "I think we both need it." And now, on the day of the operation, I was driving to the hospital, wondering if we could keep that promise. Would we have the courage to be honest with each other? Would we have the patience to hear what might be painful to hear? I ran into Lauren in the hospital hallway. She looked exhausted, but was holding her own. "He's already been taken to pre-op," she said. "Dr. Holder said the surgery will take about 6 hours." 6 hours of waiting. 6 hours to think about the past, the future, all the things Garrett and I never said to each other. "Was he calm?" I asked, trying to imagine how my son must feel right now, lying on a cold table, waiting for strangers to dig into his heart. He was trying to joke. Lauren smiled weakly. "You know how he is," but I could see he was scared. I nodded. Garrett always joked when he was scared, even as a child, before shots, before his first day of school, before his final exams. It was his way of coping with fear. Lauren and I sat down in the waiting area. Soon we were joined by Peyton, Ricardo, and Ewan. My family, so different, so diverse, yet bound together by invisible threads of blood and shared history. Time dragged agonizingly slowly. I thought about Garrett, the little boy with scraped knees, the teenager who slammed doors, the young man who proudly introduced his first wife to his family. So many moments, so many missed opportunities for understanding, for closeness. "He'll be fine, Mom," Peyton said, noticing the look on my face. "Dr. Holder is the best heart surgeon in the state." I nodded, not trusting my voice. It was strange to hear words of comfort from a daughter who had always been so businesslike, so rational. Perhaps Garrett's illness had changed not only our relationship, but the entire family. After 5 hours of waiting, Dr. Holder emerged, young, but with the tired eyes of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "The surgery was successful," he said with a slight smile. "We replaced the valve and closed the defect in the septum. Mr. Sloot is in intensive care now and will be transferred to a regular ward soon." The relief I felt was almost physical, as if a weight that had been pressing on my shoulders all day had suddenly disappeared. "When can we see him?" Lauren asked, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "In a couple of hours," Dr. Holder replied, "but only for a few minutes today. He needs rest." We waited another 2 hours before the nurse allowed us to take turns visiting Garrett. I let Lauren go first. No matter how their relationship had turned out, she was closer to him than any of us. When it was my turn, I froze at the door for a moment, gathering my courage. Then I went in. Garrett was lying on a hospital bed, pale, with tubes coming out of his hands and nose. He looked so vulnerable, so far from the loud, confident man he had always tried to be. "Hi, Mom." His voice was weak, hoarse from the tube that had recently been in his throat. "As you can see, I'm still here." "I never doubted it," I said, moving closer and gently taking his hand. "You've always been a fighter, Garrett, ever since you were a kid." He smiled weakly, his eyelids heavy from the medication dripping through the IV. "I was right about you," he mumbled, already falling asleep. "You really are the best mom anyone could ask for." I wasn't sure if he was delirious from the anesthesia, but his words touched me deeply. The recovery from the operation was long and difficult. Garrett moved in with me. Temporarily, he insisted, although we both knew he had nowhere else to go. The first few weeks were the hardest. The pain, the limitations, the dependence on others. It was all difficult for my proud, independent son. But gradually, our life together fell into a rhythm. In the morning, I helped him with his dressings. Then we had breakfast on the porch, weather permitting. In the afternoon, he rested or watched TV while I went about my business. Painting, gardening, reading. In the evening, we had dinner together, sometimes joined by Peyton and his family or Ewan, sometimes by Lauren. And we talked. We really talked, not about the weather or the news, but about important things. About how he felt abandoned after his father died. About how I was afraid I couldn't handle 3 children on my own. About his drinking problem, my regrets, our mutual hurts and disappointments. These weren't easy conversations. Sometimes we argued, sometimes we cried, sometimes we didn't speak for days, unable to continue. But we always returned to the dialogue, remembering our promise to be honest. 3 months later, Garrett was strong enough to start looking for a job. To my surprise, he decided to change careers. "I want to work with people," he said over dinner, "maybe in social services or something like that. After everything that's happened, I realize I want to do something meaningful." I didn't remind him that he used to think such work was women's work and unworthy of a real man. People change. Sometimes it takes nearly dying to change your outlook on life. 6 months after his surgery, Garrett got a job as a counselor at a rehabilitation center for people with alcohol addiction. The irony didn't escape either of us. He, who had struggled with his own demons for so long, was now helping others in their struggle. Lauren didn't come back to him, but they remained friends. She often came to visit us, and I saw a mixture of love and regret in her eyes when she looked at Garrett. Some wounds are too deep to heal completely. On my 69th birthday, the whole family gathered at my house, not out of a sense of duty, not for appearances, but because we really wanted to be together. Garrett was sober, calm, even happy. Peyton was less bossy and more attentive. Ewan talked about his work with unexpected enthusiasm. The grandchildren played in the garden, noisy and carefree. Looking at them, I thought about the journey we had taken over the past year, from a complete breakdown to an imperfect but sincere reunion. No, we didn't become the perfect family you see in commercials. We still had problems, misunderstandings, moments of tension. Garrett still lost his temper sometimes. I still withdrew into myself sometimes. Peyton still tried to control everyone, and Ewan tried to distance himself. But we learned one important thing: to be honest with each other, to talk about our feelings, fears, and hopes, not pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. And in that honesty, as painful as it was at times, we found real closeness. "What are you thinking about, Mom?" Garrett asked, sitting down next to me on the porch while the others set the table. "About us," I answered honestly, "about how strange life is. Sometimes it takes the hardest trials to understand the simplest things." "Like what?" He smiled, and in that smile I saw echoes of the little boy I once rocked in my arms. "Like how family isn't an obligation. It's a choice we make every day." Garrett looked at me for a long time, then said quietly, "I'm glad we both made the right choice." I nodded, watching the setting sun paint the sky shades of pink and gold. Yes, we made the right choice. Not the easiest, not the most obvious, but the right one. And every day we continued to make that choice again and again, the choice to be a family, with all the mess, pain, and joy that comes with it.